Hey there. Welcome, or maybe welcome back if you've been here from the start in our AZ-801, where it's all about configuring Windows Server Hybrid Advanced Services. In this next module, we're going to zoom in on disaster recovery. Now, if you've been here from the start, we're in module 5, but we don't really like to count the numbers that much because it's just about the totality of the package, right? Now, in the previous module, we already talked about disaster recovery. But as you might remember, the flow of the course is always starting with on-prem scenarios, and then the next module is covering the same topic, but then zooming in on how we can sprinkle some Azure knowledge on top of that. And that's really what we're going to do in this module. So we're going to start with hybrid backup. What it means is you have servers running on premises, and yes, maybe Azure virtual machines already, and we're going to use Azure Backup as our backup tool in a couple of different motions that we'll obviously talk about. From there, we're going to jump to the other part of disaster recovery, where we're going to bring in Azure Site Recovery and maybe, yes, bringing it in again, but now focusing on if I'm running my Azure virtual machines, how can I use Azure Site Recovery to build out my disaster recovery scenario when I'm using multiple Azure regions. So with that, I would say let's jump in because it's another pretty cool and exciting topic. So what does it mean to run hybrid backup? So as always, we start with just sharing some bullet points on what are you learning out of this section. So I think this is probably an easier one for a lot of you because I'm confident to say that you probably all know what backup is about. We do backups to allow us to restore in case we have like potential data loss or maybe something goes wrong with the environment, like maybe again a cyber attack as an easy example. But it could also be like a user maybe by coincidence deleting a file. So in short, what we're going to cover is obviously what is Azure Backup? It's a backup solution running in Azure. That's going to be easy. And technically zooming in on the actual services, where the branding is Recovery Service Vault. That's really the Azure resource we need to deploy. From there, like any other traditional backup tool you might already be familiar with, we're going to look into some policies. How can we make sure that our backups are working? What are the settings we can use there? And then obviously touching not only on how to run a backup, but also touching on how to actually run a restore. Where we're going to zoom in a little bit on the file restore, like restoring individual files or restoring a full folder. And then obviously touching on the same concept, but moving into running an Azure virtual machine and then using Azure Backup to allow us to take backups from our Azure running workloads. Now, when you think about Azure Backup, again, I think it's quite easy to explain. It's just another backup solution, but it's actually pretty convenient for a lot of different ways. Why? First of all, it's already part of the platform, which means you don't need to deploy your own backup solution. Like I remember, and you know in meantime that I've been around the industry for quite a while, and I wouldn't say I've used or deployed like almost all possible Windows environment backup solutions from third-party vendors, but I've seen a lot of them. Even like years ago, just the built-in Windows backup that you have out of the server operating system. I mean, in the end, it works fine. It does what it needs to do. And that's like that simplification that I always like to bring in when I'm talking about Azure Backup, because it's part of the platform. But on top of that, it allows you to not only backup content in Azure, like Azure virtual machines, and then maybe a little bit off topic for this course focus, but you could also use it for like Azure App Services backups, SQL database backups, and even better, and that's obviously related to the content in this course, it's also allowing you to do hybrid backups. Next to that, like what you can expect from any traditional backup tool, it's identical. So it allows you to do short-term backups as well as long-term backups, interacting obviously with Azure storage in the backend. And then the other thing I want to emphasize is additional built-in security. Like you can define role-based access because not all admins should have permissions to interact with the Recovery Services Vault. And you can define alerting notifications. And obviously you're going to use it to run a recovery as well. Got a couple of screenshots here, but you can already imagine that I like to show you live how this actually works. But in short, the starting point is implementing Azure Recovery Service Vault. That's really the name of the service. And then within Recovery Service Vault, we're going to define our backup policies. So you deploy the Service Vault, you can use the portal, you can use Azure templates, or you can obviously use CLI, PowerShell, or Azure Command Line to get everything up and running. You deploy it in a specific region, and from there, you can decide how you're going to use it. Now, one of the first options here is what we call the MARS agent, and that's really the mechanism we're going to use for hybrid backups. So MARS agent stands for Microsoft Azure Resources Vault Services Agent. So you deploy the Recovery Vault, and from there you're going to define the policies, and next you're going to deploy that agent like a little piece of software, right, towards your on-prem/hybrid running servers. So what we're going to do is, instead of like using the built-in Windows Server backup, we are reusing the same concept, but instead of storing the backup files on the operating system itself or within the server itself, we're now benefiting from that cloud backend using Azure Storage and integrating Azure Backup policies. Another screenshot here where you can see that we have quite some flexibility on what we call the father, grandfather, son concept in backups, which means that you're going to take like a real-time backup, could be at any point in time, manual or scheduled, like easy example, let's say 9 o'clock in the evening, after hours, we're going to take the backup and obviously integrating with the Shadow engine that we describe in Windows platform, which allows you to backup open files as well. So you don't have to stop any services. And again, it's nothing really different from your traditional third-party backup tool if you're not using Windows backup already. Next to that, you're going to define that short-term retention, like keep my backups in Azure Storage for maybe at least a couple of days. And then from there, we're going to offload them to a weekly backup, to a monthly backup, and then multi-year backup, where Azure Backup supports up to 99 years, which I always think is a pretty interesting number. And honestly, I never looked into like, where is that exact 99 years coming from? But at the same time, in 99 years from now, I wouldn't really worry if I could still restore my Azure virtual machine that I'm running today. And then from there, you have your backup jobs, they're running, and obviously you're going to validate. So we have the monitoring. And then last, it's not just about taking backups, but obviously also allowing us to run restores, where you can restore individual files, restoring individual folders, and if you want, you could even restore full virtual machines as well. I would say that's been a lot of screenshots, right? So let me jump to my demo environment and show you how you can take a backup of a Windows server. It's running on my Hyper-V demo setup, and I'm going to take a full backup of one of my client servers. So the starting point in this demo is the Azure Recovery Service Vault. Now, to speed up the demo a little bit, I already prepared quite some steps in my environment, but the ones that I left out or the ones that are too easy. I mean, just deploying Recovery Vault is not the most challenging part of the demo scenario, or the ones that are taking quite some time. So that's where we have done some cleanup, you could say. Assuming that your backup vault or recovery vault is already deployed, we would then look into backup items. And from there, since we're talking about hybrid backup, we're going to select Azure Backup Agent. And that's really that MARS that I talked about. So I'm going to move on. And then you can see I already have a server up and running, but I can show you how you can add a new server into this scenario. So the first question up here is, where is the workload running? So for now, we go for on-premises. What do you want to back up? So obviously, depending on the source environment, these settings might be different, but I'll select files and folders. And I could maybe do system state as well. And from there, it's going to prepare the infrastructure. We have a few options here. So what we need to do next is downloading the agent. And then once the download is done, we also need to create a Vault credential file. So I'm going to download the agent. And then selecting I downloaded it. And then from there, downloading my credential Vault file as well. So that's all that needs to happen from here. So I'm going to switch to my server and then continuing from there. So I'm on my server where I downloaded the backup install tool and the Vault credentials coming in from the Azure portal. So starting up the process where it's opening up the configuration wizard. And again, most of this, at least in my setup, is just next, finish, and done. So it's going to install the MARS service agent, no proxy settings. Always recommend using Windows updates. And that's pretty much all we have to select from here. With the baseline software install done, we're now moving on and registering the server. And that's where we need the Vault credential file. This allows us to register the server. And as you can see here, it's also offering to store this in Key Vault. I'm going to turn this off in my environment and storing the files locally. But in a production environment, I would highly recommend you to store it in that secret store in Azure. So that's all that we needed to do for the actual install. And then it's going to offer to run the actual Azure backup. What we need to do from here is scheduling a backup job where we can select what items we want to backup. I'm just going to go for my downloads folder or all user profiles. Why not? But this could be a lot more complex. Obviously, scheduling the backup time, the different retention options we have, weekly, monthly, yearly, with a lot more retention. Transferring over the network sounds good to me. And that's all it takes to actually run our backup schedule. Then from here, we can force a backup. And as I mentioned during the presentation, I think it's recommended to just run this so you know everything is working as expected and not finding out the day after that some of it was not working as it should be. Now from here, the backup is running. So if I step out of my server and I check back in my Azure environment, you can see that now our backups are nicely coming in. So I could now switch to one of my other servers where I did a full backup of my system state and the C and E drives. I can validate the details, and then obviously I could also run restores. Now this is all happening from within Azure. So what it means is that we can go back to our server, the backup job got complete, and now we can move into recovering data, recover on this server. In this region, we're going to recover individual files. I need to select my backup files, the latest backup that we have. It's going to mount the backup files, and then it's basically selecting the ones that I want to grab out of it. I showed you for files and folders, but it would be the same scenario if it would be a full server. So with that, let's move on with the presentation. So that all worked. And just a little recap here to nicely close off the topic. So in short, we have on-prem running workloads. We're going to use Azure Backup, like the Azure Backup service, using that Azure Recovery Services Vault. And like always, there's a bit of planning. What we describe here as before you start, it means you need to integrate the service. You're going to think about the permissions. You're going to think about what servers do I have in my on-prem environment that I want to push into Azure Backup. And then from there, obviously, going to look into what kind of capacity do we need? What is my backup schedule like to define or be able to define your policies? From there, you're going to integrate it. You deploy that MARS agent, and you're going to start that on-demand backup. Again, typically when you deploy the backup service, and I'll show you that later on again, you're going to start preferably a manual backup. And the big reason why is if you deploy that service, like I showed you in the demo, and you schedule it for like 9 o'clock in the evening, well, the first time it's actually going to take a while. So I always like to click on that manual enable backup or backup now to make sure that you already have that backup when you're actually deploying the service. And then back to the recovery piece. So you can restore files, you can restore servers, and that's mainly what we want to emphasize here. And then last on the right-hand side, if you lose an entire server, remember that you have that Azure Instant Restore, as we call it, allowing you to grab the full image where the starting point would be deploying a Windows machine on-prem and then overriding system state, overriding the operating system and pushing in like the services, the files, folders, and if you have any databases, it will be restored as well. All that to jump to the next topic, where we're now still talking about Azure Backup, but this time we're talking about Azure running virtual machines. The listing of what we're going to talk about is pretty easy because we already positioned Azure Backup, and obviously it's not really changing apart from a little exception that we don't really need to deploy an agent anymore because it's the Azure virtual machine talking to the backup service and it's all managed out of the Azure platform. So I'm going to show you about the same. I got my Azure virtual machines running. We're going to deploy Azure Backup out of that recovery service vault and then showing you how to run the backup from an Azure VM into Azure Backup, and then obviously showing you what the restore looks like as well. Touching a little bit more on Azure Backup features, scenarios. We already talked about the hybrid scenario, like running servers on-prem, and then from there, allowing you to really benefit from that Azure Backup cloud service. We're actually adding more capabilities into this scenario where we're going to use Azure Backup to backup Azure virtual machines. Next to that, you can see here in the second column, we also position Azure Site Recovery. Now, we'll talk about this in just a couple of minutes, but the main idea is that we're going to think about our disaster recovery. That's really the topic, right, out of the module, where taking backups might not be good enough anymore. There's nothing wrong with backups. I hope it's clear that you should enable backups for all your environments. But next to that, Azure Site Recovery could also be beneficial. And again, I like to point back to my days of consulting, deploying servers at customers, deploying hybrid scenarios at customers. And if I was in charge, like if it was like my project, right, I would always defend Azure Backup together with Azure Site Recovery in an Azure to Azure scenario or in a hybrid scenario where the customer was already benefiting from cloud like 10, 12 years ago. So what does it take to get your Azure virtual machine into Azure Backup? So baseline, it's the same what we talked about before. Starting point is deploying that recovery services vault resource in Azure using the portal, using command line, using template-based deployment. And then from there, you're going to enable the backup policies, and it's going to allow you to take those snapshots, like grabbing that point-in-time backup for any kind of data running inside the VM, which could be, as we mentioned, SQL services, traditional web server, file server, and you can actually decide if you want to integrate like SAP HANA is another example. Specifically for SQL Server, there's some fine-tuning, and it's not about just Windows. Maybe I didn't emphasize that yet, but you could also use it for Linux machines. So a sample diagram here, how it actually works in the backend of the Azure platform. So we start with our Azure virtual machine running in a specific region, and underneath we have our storage, like the virtual machine disks, right? Next to that, we deploy the Azure Backup Service, technically called Azure Recovery Service Vault, and we enable our backup policy. We launch the manual backup. That's again what I like to do for the initial deployment, making sure that we have everything up and running. Also, partly I would say, it's not that I don't trust the service, but like if I deploy my Azure Backup, configure it for like an overnight backup, why would I wait to find out like, oops, I missed something in my policy, I do not have the correct permissions, and then finding out that the backup job is failing. So that's where I like that manual trigger, you could say, to make sure that everything is running and everything is in place as expected. And then from there, once you take the backup, obviously we're going to talk about restoring as well, which means restoring a full virtual machine where you can overwrite the existing, or you could also restore to a new virtual machine. So it really depends on what is the reason for actually running that disaster recovery. You could restore a disk, like individual disks, operating system disks, so not really different there. You can replace existing disks, but also the full virtual machine, or even mounting a backup file and then restoring some individual files and folders. Instead of restoring like the whole virtual machine, just grabbing the files that you might need to restore. All of this works within the same region, but if you want, you could also configure like hybrid across different regions, where you could run your virtual machine in region 1 and then running the restore in a different region. Just keep in mind that you do have that ingress egress network traffic, which also comes with a cost once you start moving away from one single region. So that let me walk you through another demo here, where I'm going to show you once more how to deploy Azure Recovery Service Vault, but this time for Azure virtual machines, configuring the backup job for one of my demo VMs running in Azure, and then showing you how it actually runs, already going to one of my other VMs to just speed up the demo a little bit, and then showing you a bit what that restore procedure looks like for a full virtual machine or individual files and folders. So for this one, we're back in our Azure portal, where I'm once more moving over to my Azure Backup Vault. And actually a lot is identical to the previous demo, but this time we're going to use an Azure virtual machine, which technically actually makes it a lot easier. So we navigate to Backup Items over here, and this time we select Azure Virtual Machine. Now you can see there are a few different specific Azure Virtual Machine scenarios. So if you want to back up SQL, SAP, or any of the other options, know that that might be the option as well. So I go for Azure Virtual Machine. I already have one to speed up parts of the demo, but let's add a new server. Server is running in Azure. What do I want to backup? Well, now this time I'm going for virtual machine, but you can see if we have Azure file shares, or again, any of those SQL database or SAP database specifics, that would be your preferred option. Next, we are already in the backup configuration, where we have two different options. We can go for enhanced option, which means more options, more details, 30-day retention, compatible with trusted launch VMs, and support for Ultra disks and Premium. If you don't need any of these options, then obviously you would select standard. Next, we assume if you go for enhanced backup, you would go for the enhanced policy, but nothing blocks you from creating a new one, and that's where you are in control of the options. So you can define the frequency of the backups, hourly, daily, weekly, and similar to traditional and hybrid Azure backup, you can also specify the retention settings. Once all these configuration options are done, you basically end up in this step again, where you have your backup server items up and running. The job was complete. So now we can move into the details, and we can see that our backup has been running over the last couple of days, just to have a little bit more data in my demo scenario. Now what we have here is crash consistent, application consistent, and file consistent. The reason why most of my backups are crash consistent is because my virtual machines are not always running. So that's where you can see that we're still trying to take a backup, but this is happening while the server is not running. So probably not always your real world scenario. If I got lucky and I have my backups running when my server was running, like in this case somewhere overnight earlier this week, it's now moving to application consistent. And that means it's creating a full backup of the server, allowing me to restore my application like a web server, mail server, database server. That would be the scenario. I can obviously run restores as well. So there's a few options as explained in the presentation. We can restore a full virtual machine based on any of the possible backup items we have. And we can replace an existing, or we can create a new one. I'm not going to bore you with waiting for this restore, but just emphasizing that you can create a new VM, you can link it to different subscriptions and different resource group and network settings. So you could almost move to like some sort of a safe, secure, protected offline backup, where you're going to run the virtual machine, but it's not connected to the production network. If I close this, I can show you the file recovery option as well, where the concept obviously is quite identical. but it means that this time, instead of restoring the full server, it's now restoring or giving us the option to restore files and folders. To make this work, we need to download an executable, which is basically a PowerShell script together with a password captured in an executable file. The script got generated. I'm going to download it. And this is where the PowerShell script comes in. So it asks me to copy the password. And then from here, it's running the actual PowerShell script. So I'm going to continue. What it's doing now is creating a temporary storage location and then eventually mounting the disk and showing me my content from an Explorer perspective. And that's what it looks like. Whoops. So it's on my local machine. It's the E drive, but then you can see here, it's not my local user, but the backup of some user profiles on a separate disk that I have. So from here, I could, after my restore, I could close this. I can dismount the disk and then basically recovering. So it mentions here, click unmount disk in step 3 in the portal. So that's what we're going to do last. We're going to unmount the disks and everything is back as it was before. So that's what I wanted to show you, how to enable Azure Virtual Machine Backup using Azure Recovery Vault and Azure Backup, and how to run a restore using different scenarios. So that all worked, but as you remember from the introduction of this module, just using Azure Backup might not be the only disaster recovery option. And that's where I'm going to talk through our last section here, positioning Azure Site Recovery. Now, if you were here since the start, or at least you watched the previous module, we already positioned Azure Site Recovery. So it's not a different service because now we're talking about Azure virtual machines, moving them into Site Recovery. So a lot of this will be quite straightforward because, again, nothing's really changing apart from the source, but the target environment will be Azure anyway. So as always, let's have a look at what we're going to talk about in this section. So again, briefly, a recap on what is Azure Site Recovery about, how to prepare for disaster recovery, in between bringing in a demo, how to get it up and running, like the initial baseline configuration. Then we have to wait a bit for our virtual machines to replicate the offline information from one Azure region to the other. That's where I'm going to jump in, talking a bit about that actual disaster recovery drill, and then quickly jumping back to our demo setup, where I'm going to show you what it takes to run that failover and performing the failback. So I would say let's just jump in because it's still one of my favorite topics, actually. So again, in short, what is Azure Site Recovery? It's that virtual machine disaster recovery scenario. Already positioned it from an on-prem/hybrid scenario where we could use Azure Site Recovery as that orchestrator. And now we're basically doing the same, but the source environment is now an Azure virtual machine instead of running on-prem or hybrid. What we're doing here, the setup is running your Azure virtual machines. They're active, they're running in a specific Azure region. And from there, thanks to Azure Site Recovery, we're going to replicate them, we're going to clone them into a different Azure region. I remember in the early days of Azure Site Recovery, even right on the edge with Azure Classic like 15 years ago, that it was limited, but sounds a bit wrong, but it's actually not. It was limited to a specific geography, which means if you run your virtual machines in, let's say, Azure US data center region, you could only replicate within that US region, or within Europe or within Asia, pretty obvious. Where now, and it could be beneficial for some customers, you could now replicate across the globe. So the way it works is you enable ASR, you define, hey, I want you to use all these specific Azure virtual machines. And from there, we're going to clone them. It's the backend process in Azure taking care of all this. It's going to clone it to another region. when we have a disaster going on, you basically go into Azure Site Recovery, you run the failover, it's going to start up the cloned virtual machine, and from there, allowing you to run it for a couple of hours, a couple of days, and then you're going to run your failback. One of the important parts here is obviously running a disaster recovery drill. So what this means is that built in the platform, we have a test failover scenario, which means that you're going to run a failover, but it's not impacting your live production workload. It's like you have your active VM, it's going to clone to an offline VM, which, by the way, is another big benefit in disaster recovery, because it means that the target virtual machines are not that expensive. As long as you don't have to run them like during an actual disaster, it means that you don't pay for compute. You still pay for the underlying storage, obviously, but you might have a pretty big beast of a server that now becomes pretty affordable in a disaster recovery scenario. And then out of that disaster, again, you preferably run a test failover. What it's going to do is grabbing your active running VM, cloning it to an offline VM, and then during the test failover, it's actually cloning the already cloned VM and starting up the second copy to make sure that your production disaster recovery scenario is not getting impacted. Now, all of that is just to go back like, well, it's a disaster recovery scenario where now the actual use case is in case of a disaster, right? Which could be planned or unplanned. Like, oh, we know that over the weekend, we have some outages in a specific Azure region, maybe based on your own maintenance plans where you go like, well, I'm just going to move something out to a different region. And that's really what that service is for. Unplanned obviously means that something's happening within your Azure virtual machines, inside the VM itself, inside the application running within, and you didn't really plan for the outage. Like again, a cyber attack, I think, is an easy example, unfortunately, but still a quite common scenario where now you can rely on that Azure Site Recovery cloned VM on the other side, and then obviously probably not restoring the latest recovery state, but maybe the one from like right before the cyber attack happened. And then running the failover failback, like eventually after disaster got fixed, you're going to fail back, and we call it a failover, but it's running in the other direction. And then from there, also important, you need to run a reprotection, which now means you're sort of telling Azure, this is my prime active VM. We're now in a disaster recovery state, so my second site is actually taking over. You're going to fail back, and then you need to confirm like, okay, everything looks good. And I'm confirming that my original prime source is now again the new prime source, you could say. Every now and then, obviously, a couple of things could go wrong. So again, I've deployed, I don't know how many times, Azure Site Recovery over like my 15-something years as a cloud consultant. And every now and then, the replication would fail. For example, based on latency. It could not replicate the virtual machines fast enough. Next to that, you might have some quota issues, or you might replicate a virtual machine size into a target region where during the disaster, the virtual machine size might not be available. Now, the other cool thing I didn't really emphasize is that it doesn't need to be identical virtual machine sizes. So you could have a big server in your production environment and then cloning to a smaller virtual machine size as your disaster recovery. Because maybe, obviously, all depending on what the scenario looks like, but maybe you don't have all your users or you don't need all your customers connecting to your disaster recovery scenario. And that's where you don't have to use that one-on-one matching. Enough talking about it. Let's jump in our environment and walk you through a full demo how to configure site recovery for an Azure running virtual machine. Waiting for the replication to start, then I'm going to switch to my other environment and showing you what a failover actually could look like as well. So let me walk you through this scenario where we're going to use Azure Site Recovery to protect and recover our virtual machines running in Azure. So again, like most of my demos, right, I already have some baseline configuration done. So I deployed an Azure Recovery Services Vault, and within I went into replicated items, where you could see it's basically a combination of backup and replication. So it's really that disaster recovery coming in. Now, two of my servers are flagged as critical. It's because they're not running all the time, and that's where they're running behind a little bit. But that should not block us from actually recovering, which could also happen in a real world scenario. Now, before running a restore or a recovery, let's add some more servers into the story. So what we're going to do here is selecting replicate, and we're going to go for Azure virtual machines. It's going to ask me like, hey, where can I find those VMs? So I can just go for a resource group. Where do I have them? Need to make sure I'm going to the correct region here. Don't have multi-zone, so not worrying about that part. I can select individual virtual machines. So I'm going to grab one of these. For now, it's going to ask me some replication settings, like this is where we build up the target environment. So it's suggesting a target resource group. And for now, obviously, you already know it could be a lot more complex in your environment, but I'm just going to accept all the suggestions. Click next, and that's basically all we have to do. And from there, enabling replication. So now I can go back to one of my already protected servers, and protected here means that they are 100% in sync. So I'm going to select one of my servers. And what I can see here is, first of all, a little bit of the history, like the events, what happened with my server. Now, as you can see again, some of my servers are pre-deployed. They're offline for a couple of days. And then whenever I need them, I'm going to start them up. So that's where I have some warnings, error messages that the health state is not 100% okay. But again, this is not blocking me to perform my failover. Now, as mentioned, in a real world scenario, you would first go for a test failover. And the reason why is obviously because you want to make sure that everything is working as it should be. You can choose which recovery point you want to use, or the latest, most up-to-date one, or any specific one, any given in time, and also which Azure VNet you want to link it with. Now, you could run the test failover. It's going to clone the already cloned VM and then trying to start it up. Now, another option is running an actual failover. And what we're going to ask you here is, hey, watch out, you didn't perform a test failover, and you need to confirm like, yes, I know, and it's totally fine. So in like a test environment proof of concept, I would say I don't really see any issues here. And I'm going to run my failover. If it can reach the running virtual machine, it's going to offer you to perform a grace shutdown, and I think that's a valid option in this scenario. Now, while that kicked off, let me show you what my running servers look like. So I do have 3 servers here running in East US 2. I configured my failover for server number 3. And then the one that I actually am failing over is, again, 2 servers. You never know what's going to happen in demos. So having some sort of a backup scenario is fine. Where I configured my ASR VMs, they're still running, and in just a little bit, you're going to see that my job is running. And from there, it's going to nicely shut everything down, running the failover, and allowing me to obviously run in a disaster recovery. So I keep this running for just a little bit, and then we can check back what's happening. Another way to validate what's going on is going back to our recovery vault, checking ASR, and looking at the monitoring section, and obviously site recovery. Well, now we can see here that our ASR demo VM1 failover is running pre-checks, shutting down the VM, starting failover, and it means that it's almost done. So if I switch back to my VMs and I refresh my browser, you can see that now my failing over virtual machine VM1 is already in a stopped state. So let's switch back to the reporting and give it a little bit of time to complete that actual failover. As you can see, in just a couple of minutes in my demo environment, took about 2 minutes. So you could say in total, less than 3 minutes to go through a full disaster recovery. So let me close this view here, switching back to my virtual machines. And if I refresh, you can now see that we do have our VM1, but this time it's running in our disaster recovery region. It's nicely running. It's the same size, but keep in mind that you could change that. And my prime original VM is still offline as we expected. From here, when we go back to our replicated items and we select virtual machine 1, you can now see that the the recovery is complete. And what we need to do here is committing the changes. So this is telling ASR, like, yep, I validated my server and everything is good to go. And then from there, we're gonna trigger a reprotection because right now we have still our offline prime server. We're now running in disaster recovery. And that means to have this in a full, like, real world scenario, you would go for our reprotect because now your disaster recovery obviously also needs to be protected. But it's basically the same steps. And then obviously from there, you're gonna trigger synchronization, all depending on the scenario. If you still have your on-prem server, maybe you don't have it anymore. And that's where you might need to synchronize the full server or only the delta from the disaster recovery timeline. That's all I wanted to share about ASR in this demo. Let's switch back to the presentation. Good. I'm actually quite happy that all of this worked because I hope I shared my passion and excitement for Azure Backup and Site Recovery. And when demos are working, that's always nice. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this module where it was all about implementing disaster recovery, where this one was zooming in on what does it mean in a hybrid scenario using Azure Virtual Machines at the start. And we're going to integrate Azure Backup for the Azure Virtual Machines. And then next, Azure Site Recovery to allow us building a disaster recovery within Azure regions. With that, as always, I would like to thank you for being here with me. And next to that, we're not at the end of the course yet. So I would like to invite you to join me to the next video where we're going to talk about more Azure capabilities. Thank you for now and see you again soon.